How certain must you be about something before you can really say that you know it? It's a trick question. You see, knowledge isn't actually a measure of certainty. In order to have knowledge, there must be some kind of evidence, and the only method for obtaining evidence happens to be incompatible with absolute certainty. In other words, there is a trade-off. You cannot have knowledge until you are willing to let go of your certainty. So a comment appeared on my YouTube channel claiming that contrary to physics textbooks, angular momentum is not actually conserved. Naturally, I was skeptical, so I asked for a reproducible experiment. When people are skeptical about established science, I think it's a good idea to ask how they know. The usual response is to talk about how absolutely certain they are. But certainty and knowledge are two very different things. Certainty is personal. Knowledge can be shared. Certainty is based on feelings. Knowledge is based on something quantifiable. Certainty is subjective. Knowledge is objective. And certainty always focuses on conclusions, whereas knowledge focuses on the reasons. They're really quite opposite each other, so I was braced for this guy to share his subjective feelings and tell me how certain he was about his conclusions. But he did something that really surprised me. He told me how to measure it for myself. Well, that was surprising and kind of refreshing, so of course I had to give it a try. I sacrificed a ballpoint pen for science, I tied a water bottle to some dental floss I happened to have in my office, and I set up my phone to observe the experiment. When I shortened the length of the pendulum, it began orbiting somewhat faster. That's exactly what one would expect if angular momentum is conserved. But then I went back and counted the frames in my video. The speedup was not proportional to the square of the change in radius. How interesting. But I was pretty sure that was just due to the crudeness of my setup. Maybe Euler's equation for angular momentum didn't really apply to pendulums. I don't know, I'm not even a physicist. But I do tend to put a lot of faith in modern science. Euler established the equation for angular momentum over 200 years ago, and scientists have done a lot of work with things that rotate since that time. I was pretty confident that this equation had been thoroughly tested, so I imagined it would be kind of fun to prove this animammal guy wrong. So I went home and I hung a swivel in my garage. I attached a lightweight aluminum pole to it, and I affixed relatively heavy lead weights to both ends of the pole. And I rigged it with a rope so I could pull the weights closer together. I then performed several trial runs with different rates of rotation and different changes in the gap between the weights. Since I was recording video of all my trial runs, I could measure the precise number of pixels between the weights, both before and after I pulled them closer together. And I could count the exact number of frames in each rotation, both before and after I moved the weights. I doubt Euler even had such a nice experimental setup, so I was pretty confident that if he could arrive at the equations for angular momentum in the 1700s, I could probably do it even better. So after I measured all the pixels and counted all the frames, I finally plotted my data. The horizontal axis shows the distance changed between the weights. The vertical axis shows how the rate of rotation changed. Physics tells us that rotation should change by the square of the change in distance, so I expected my points to fall approximately on this curve. And here is the data I actually measured. Clearly something was wrong. But what? I did not know. Could this animammal guy actually be right? Is it possible that fundamental physics is really broken? I seriously began to doubt. I mean, sure, this equation has been checked for over 200 years, but I actually tested it myself. I measured it with my own equipment. I counted pixels and frames. How could that possibly be inaccurate? Why did 100% of my measurements fall so far below the curve? So I started looking for ways my experiment might be biased. Sure, there's air resistance, but I think that should be negligible against lead weights. Sure, my string got a little bit twisted, but I did use a swivel, so that shouldn't have had a big effect. And sure, pulling on the rope probably sapped some of the angular momentum from the system, but I didn't think it should be that significant. When I designed this experiment, I had originally intended to let the weights return to their original position, but only 2 of my trials were still spinning fast enough at the end for that to actually happen, and 2 data points isn't a lot to work with. So I decided I needed to repeat the experiment in the opposite direction. That is, I needed to start with the weights close together, then move them farther apart. But some part of me really didn't want to do this experiment. After all, it was a lot of work to set up that experiment in the first place, and why am I wasting all this time challenging basic physics anyway? Everyone knows physics is super well tested. And I didn't really like having my cherished beliefs in science challenged. If I never performed the experiment, then I could never be proven wrong. So I almost just blew off the whole experiment. But that's when I realized I didn't have any real knowledge about angular momentum. All I had was a whole lot of certainty. My certainty was based on faith in science, and here I was, pretending to be a scientist while entertaining confirmation bias, the greatest enemy of knowledge. Suddenly I knew I needed to complete this experiment, and I needed to decide right now, before I see the results, whether I am going to make this video. So I asked myself, who really trusts in science? The man who never questions science, or the man who is unafraid to question science? In my opinion, if something is really true, it can stand on its own, and it doesn't need me to defend it. So I decided I was going to make this video. I'm going to show you my results if Euler is right, and I'm going to show you my results if Euler is wrong. Either way, we're going to learn something. And I gotta admit, I'm a little bit nervous. 2 separate experiments have demonstrated that this animammal guy is not just making stuff up. I might be committing myself to becoming a science denier. So here we go. This time I set up my bar with some extra rubber bands to assist centrifugal force as it pulls the weights outward, and I performed a whole bunch of trial runs just like before. Except this time, my weights started together and ended apart. And here are my results. Again, on the horizontal axis, I'm plotting the change in distance, and on the vertical axis, I'm plotting the change in rate of rotation. Here is the expected curve, and here's what I measured with this setup. This time, only 2 of my measurements fell beneath the expected curve, and the vast majority of my data points fell above the curve. So what exactly does this mean? Well, my first batch of experiments were set up such that any loss of momentum would be measured when it was spinning faster, and my second batch of experiments were set up such that any loss of momentum would be measured when it was spinning slower. So the real equation for angular momentum in a frictionless environment must lie somewhere between these 2 batches. And the standard equation for angular momentum lies right between them. Except for these 2 data points, but they're pretty close. I think we can attribute that just to noise. So ultimately, I tried, and I failed, to falsify the standard equation for angular momentum. But I think some explanation is still needed for this rather large gap. I believe animammal is measuring a real phenomenon. I measured it myself with both my pendulum experiment and with my first batch of measurements. I just didn't find any evidence that it was actually necessary to adjust the standard equation for angular momentum. These days, people get really annoyed when someone claims to have more knowledge than they can actually back up, and I think that's probably what's happening to this animammal guy. My hypothesis is that pulling the string shorter really does sap some of the angular momentum from the system. I don't know why, I feel like it shouldn't, but the phenomenon is pretty consistent. And it seems to go away when the experiment is performed in reverse. That is, if you start the weights close together, then let them move apart, the results come out very close to the standard equation for angular momentum. Maybe some physicist out there could chime in with some kind of helpful explanation for why pulling on the string saps angular momentum. In the end, I was rather surprised to find out just how difficult it really is to accurately measure angular momentum. I used to think we knew all there is to know about that, and now, honestly, I'm not so sure. But it is very consistent with my experience to observe that knowledge almost never increases certainty. More often than not, it is quite the opposite. As Aristotle famously wrote, "The more you know, the more you realize you don't know." I think people who confuse certainty with knowledge make a really big mistake. They're not the same thing at all. Certainty makes people think they have little to learn, and that inhibits knowledge. Knowledge makes people aware of how much more there is to learn, and that inhibits certainty. I used to put faith in Euler, and I had a lot of faith that other scientists would speak up if they ever succeeded at falsifying his work. But now I have my own measurements to lean on. My measurements are noisy, and they're unclear. Measurements always bring up new questions, but measurements have the advantage of directly reflecting reality. So which would you prefer to have? I don't think that's actually a false dichotomy. I think we really have to choose between whether we want knowledge or certainty.